Okay, so now we're on chapter 10 of Falling Upward, and this chapter is called A Bright Sadness. And for some reason, this chapter took me a while to get through. It's a short chapter, but a lot of the themes and some of the passages just took me a while to sit with and to meditate on. And, for this podcast, I'm trying to do a good job of explaining the chapters as best that I can. And it's funny how, sometimes the shortest books or the shortest chapters can sometimes be the most powerful. And before we jump in, I want to just share with you kind of a quick summary of where we are in the book. So, as you know, Rohr is taking us on this journey to understand kind of the first half of life, this process where we're setting up our first kind of identity of who we think we are. And then there's this sort of passage that happens where we go through some sort of dark period, a dark night of the soul. Something happens that can shift us into a movement into the second half of life. And the second half of life is this period where we are discovering our true self, our true calling, and realizing that we are children of God. And in the last chapter, Rohr tells us that part of the journey into the second half of life is movement back to simplicity and being okay that we don't understand all the paradoxes that we encounter in life, and being okay that we don't understand all the pain and tragedy that goes on in the world. And I think part of that also means being okay with not understanding everything that we read in the Bible or what the Bible tells us about God. And I think it's encouraging, that chapter, we're saying this movement towards simplicity and not needing to know because we're not going to figure it out anyways. And I think I mentioned I'm still not there yet. I'm still struggling, trying to figure things out, trying the best that I can to understand certain theological viewpoints, trying my best to understand what the Bible is telling me. And so I'm still in this kind of complicated phase, but Rohr is saying as we move forward, and I guess this is very encouraging, right? That as we move forward, it's not that we're giving up on trying to understand. It's just that we're coming to a place of acceptance where we begin to realize that we're never going to figure everything out, and that it's okay to kind of just rest and trust in God. And in many ways, that's a very simple way of going back to maybe what we believed as children, that Jesus loves us, and at the end of the day, that's all we really need to know, is that we're loved by God and that God wants us to love others. I mean, it's the most basic, most simple level that we get to as maybe children or when we first become Christians. That idea that God loves us and that our duty is to love others. And Rohr is saying at some point in the second half of life, we move into that simplicity. So now we're going to talk about chapter 10, which Rohr gives this paradoxical title, A Bright Sadness, which reminds us of the title of the book, A Falling Upward. Two words that we don't really associate together, bright and sadness. And Rohr says this is kind of a sober happiness. So in this chapter, there's basically 4 themes that stuck out to me. First one is that Rohr says that a bright sadness refers to this ability to hold or accept that there's joy and suffering in life. And that takes a lot of holding and a lot of acceptance on our part, because I guess my problem is I don't like the fact that there's so much suffering in the world, and I struggle with that idea. And Rohr is saying, like, our movement, our growth in the spiritual life comes to this place where we're able to just accept the fact that there's joy and suffering. And in the second part of this chapter, Rohr says the second half of life is about looking for unity and not focusing on what divides us. And this reminds us back to what Rohr said earlier in the book, where when we're younger, sometimes we're looking for all the ways that we are different, the things that we stand out from the crowd, right? And Rohr saying, like, as we move into the later stages of our spirituality, we're now looking for ways that we all can unite, ways that we can all come together. And we're focusing on all those lovely things that unite us, not on those things that divide us. And in the third part of this book, Rohr talks about how the second half journey helps us to realize and helps us to focus on our ultimate calling. And we'll talk more about that part of it, like what our calling is and how we can kind of figure out how we play that out in our own lives. And then the end of the chapter, Rohr talks about how our calling will include falling into the good again and again. And this refers to that part of our spirituality means that we're going to continue to fall upward over and over again, meaning that each time we fall, each time we disappoint ourselves, disappoint others, it's a launching pad for us to do good again. And instead of staying defeated, we rise up again to love others. So that's kind of how the chapter is kind of broken up. Rohr begins the chapter saying, quote, "There is still darkness in the second half of life. In fact, maybe even more. But there's now a changed capacity to hold it creatively and with less anxiety. It is what John of the Cross called luminous darkness, and it explains the simultaneous coexistence of deep suffering and intense joy in the saints, which would be impossible for most of us to imagine. Period." So that first line, there is still darkness in the second half of life. In fact, maybe even more. Like, that's one of those lines I had to sit with. Because sometimes I think that whenever I go through a traumatic moment, a dark night of the soul, a time of severe pain, I'm hoping that that's it, right? I'm hoping that this is the last time I'm going to go through a darkness. And Rohr is saying, like, part of movement, the longer that we live, the more that we experience, and as we move towards greater and greater empathy, is going to mean they're going to experience more pain, more darkness. And Rohr says, in fact, maybe even more than what we experienced earlier in our life. And I was thinking about how, yeah, I guess the longer we live, the more pain we're going to see in our world. We're going to see more suffering in our world. We're going to see and experience more tragedy. We're going to see the pain and the deaths of our loved ones. We're going to go through our own illnesses and pains and emotional trauma. And I think about this right now, being in the middle of 2020 and all of the suffering that we've seen this year with COVID-19, the virus spreading around the world, people dying all over. And on top of that, we're seeing the trauma of people being excluded, xenophobia. We're seeing racism at heightened levels, or at least more visibility of it. And the Black Lives Matter movement is helping us to pay attention to just the police brutality and the systemic racism that the Black community has had to deal with for hundreds of years. And all of this is just signals to the pain, the trauma that our communities are going through. And the longer that we live, the more we're going to see it. We're going to see more and more of it. And so Rohr is saying, like, part of movement into the second half of life is a realization that the trauma, the suffering is going to continue, and we may even see more of it, depending on where we are, our culture, the community that we're in. But what's interesting is the next line where it says, but there's now a change capacity to hold it creatively and with less anxiety. So I think what's interesting is that as these various events are happening to us and to others around us, as we're seeing trauma unfold, and like right now during 2020, we're seeing trauma and pain unfold before us. Rohr is saying that as we journey through and into the second half of life, we're able to hold these dark moments, these traumas, with less anxiety. And that was hard for me to read because I struggle with anxiety. And I think part of what Rohr is saying here is that part of this ability to hold the darker moments with less anxiety is because we've come to a point of just accepting that there is suffering in this world. Rohr goes on to point out that this journey has led us to shed our ego and the various attachments that have led us away from love. He says, quote, in the second half of life, one has less and less need or interest in eliminating the negative or fearful, holding on to old hurts, feeling any need to punish other people, and making rash judgments. Your superiority complexes have gradually departed in all directions. You do not need to fight things anymore. They've just shown themselves too many times to be useless, ego-based, and counterproductive. Period. I think this is what Rohr meant in the beginning of the chapter when he says that our attitude in the second half of life moves us into the state of okayness. It's this state of acceptance and being okay with not being able to fix everything or change anybody. As we move into more empathy and love, we begin to become okay that others don't act or think exactly like us. We begin to realize that everyone is on their own journey. And sometimes their growth into love and compassion might take a longer time. And unfortunately for some, it might take their entire lifetime. And that's okay. That's not going to stop us from loving them and being patient for their own growth. And Rohr says that this is also a point where we let go of old hurts and traumas. And being able to let go or even forgive those who have deeply hurt us, like that takes a lot of time. And for some of us, therapy. And that time or how hard that's going to be is going to vary based on how much we have been hurt by that person. And some of us may never imagine being able to let go of that pain or that hatred or that bitterness towards a person, because coming to a place of acceptance or forgiveness is out of the question. But Rohr is saying, like, part of our growth, and if you look at a lot of different spiritual traditions, like coming to a place of just letting go becomes such a healthy place to get to, but it's so difficult for some of us to get there. And I don't pretend to be there. And it's one of the reasons why I go to a counselor. I go to a therapist. Because I have a hard time letting go of the pain. And what's funny is, as we go through this book, I'm reading sections and sharing with you like what it means to me. And I never want you to think that somehow I'm like evolved to the second half of life, that I'm somehow there. Because as I'm reading these chapters, I'm realizing like, oh, I would love to be there. I would love to be at the stage where I could just let go. I would love to be at the stage that I could just accept that life is filled with tragedy and joy and be able to hold that comfortably. Like, I'm just not there. And so as I'm like going through these sections, please realize that I'm struggling with this, and I'm sharing with you like what Rohr is getting at. And I hope to be able to move to that stage. Like, I'm reading this like very hopeful, like, oh man, I would love to be there. Like the second half of life, being at this place of simplicity, being able to let go of the pain. Like, I want to be there. And so it's encouraging me that on this path that we're on, like this is part of the path, is moving there in that direction. My problem is my own bitterness, my own stubborn ego is too strong, and I'm realizing that. And I hope I can move to this place of letting go and acceptance soon. I know it's a healthier place to be. And it's also hard, like as I'm like studying this and talking about it, is that passages like this in books are difficult sometimes because when we haven't experienced it, like we haven't experienced letting go fully, and we're reading about it, it's hard, like it's encouraging, but it's hard to fully understand what it means. And it's sort of like being stranded at sea and being like on an old raft, and you see off in the distance this island. You see land off in the distance, and you have like a telescope that you can kind of get a blurry picture of land is there. And so it gives you hope that that's where you're headed, but you realize you're still stuck on an old raft, and it's going to take some time before you can get to land. And I feel like Rohr's book is like that telescope. It's giving me like a blurry picture of what's ahead. And so what's ahead is exciting to me, like, to be able to get to that point of simplicity, get to that point of acceptance, and get to that point of being able to let go. Like, I can't wait to get there. But I'm realizing that I still have a lot of work to do. Rohr says, quote, "Daily life now requires prayer and discernment more than knee-jerk responses towards either the conservative or liberal end of the spectrum, period." This is definitely speaking to this process of just spending more time in meditation, in introspection, in calling out to God for help, like things that I need to do more of. We're saying like this is the process. Like part of letting go, part of having more empathy requires this kind of introspection, this meditation, this thoughtfulness and discernment, not jumping to conclusions, not taking sides so quickly, just being at a place of just observing and letting empathy and love lead us. And as we talk about the traumas and trials that happen in our life and letting go of the pain and people that have caused it, sometimes we look for ways to cope. We look for ways to deal with the turmoil and the struggle in our minds. And the simplest ways to cope is to just distract ourselves with whatever will take our mind off the pain. And unfortunately, that can lead to addictions or other unhealthy behaviors. And those coping mechanisms will then lead to more pain. And Rohr is saying that in the second half of life, instead of running to these distractions, instead we're moving towards introspection, towards prayer, towards meditation, towards those times where we can express our feelings and our pains. And for me, I've found that journaling has been helpful. Like in between seeing my therapist, where I'm expressing my pain and talking through and processing through some of my struggles. Like I've also found that for me, like journaling has been more effective than prayer for me. Like I certainly like to meditate and go on long walks. Like that's important to me. But journaling or talking about it out loud has been a way for me to express how I'm feeling. And it takes work. It's hard to sit there and meditate. It's hard to sit there and journal our feelings. But those are such better ways to cope, to actually sit with our feelings and to dwell on them, to think about them, because that's what you're doing in therapy. Is you're going to those thoughts, you're going to those places that you're trying not to think about, and it forces you to. But the more we can process through our feelings, like the more healing can happen. The trouble for me is I'd rather distract myself. I'd rather put on a movie. I'd rather be entertained because I really don't want to sit with the trauma. I don't really want to sit and think about the painful moments in my life. And this is where having a therapist and a guide to help us can be very, very fruitful. Rohr is saying that introspection, spending time in prayer or meditation can help us avoid reacting to the various issues and events around us and help us to be more thoughtful, be more discerning, be more patient as we think through issues and think through how we can love and have more empathy for others. I wish I wasn't so reactive in my own life. So this statement again from Rohr gives me hope that eventually I can move more in this direction. And it's also a reminder that I need to spend more time journaling. Like I need to spend more time thinking through those areas that I struggle with. Rohr goes on and says, quote, "The 8 Beatitudes speak to you so much more than the 10 Commandments now, period." And the law, the 10 Commandments, have been very helpful for many of us to point out the problems with ourselves, to point out the areas where we're not loving, right? It shows us the problem with our egos. And in my study of the Bible, and in my tradition, the law, the Ten Commandments, was never meant to be a salvation project. The law was never meant to be something that makes us more worthy or more loved because we followed it. Rohr goes on and says, second simplicity has its own kind of brightness and clarity, but much of it is expressed in nonverbal terms, and only when really needed. If you talk too much or too loud, you are usually not an elder. Rohr points out here that true elders don't need many words to express themselves. Elders have wisdom to listen more than speak. Elders are focused on learning and trying to understand more than teaching with words. I think part of this is that elders realize that actions speak louder than words, and that their lives in modeling Christ, in modeling what a good life looks like, can speak far more volumes than words can ever express. And so I started to ask myself, what do my actions say about me? How am I loving others? How am I mirroring love to others? My wife's always reminding me that words don't matter much. And she's right. And even some actions that we do, if done for the wrong reasons, don't matter either. And I can tell my wife and my kids that I love them every day. I can give them kisses. But if my words don't match my actions and how I'm living my life, like those kisses and those hugs and those words don't mean much. Ultimately, what matters more is how I'm actually actively loving and caring for them every day. And when I get stubborn and when I'm bitter, I'm not showing love. And those are things that I struggle with. Because when life gets tough, sometimes I get grumpy and I get stubborn. My ego shows. And those are moments where I'm not being loving. I'm not being kind. And my wife's words about actions speak louder than words, those hit me hard. I also find it interesting that he says, quote, if you talk too much or too loud, you are usually not an elder. And I don't think Rohr is being critical of talking, because he's a teacher and he teaches a lot, and part of being an elder means that you're also helping others along, being a teacher. But I think the lesson here is that we should be doing more listening than talking, more seeking to understand than talking. And this is a lesson for me because I like talking and I chat a little bit too much. And this is a reminder that I need to slow down and listen a lot more. So the next big theme in this chapter is around how in the second half of life, we begin to look for more unity rather than those things that divide us. He says, quote, when you're young, you define yourself by differentiating yourself. Now, you look for things we all share in common. You find happiness in a likeness, which has become much more obvious to you now. And you do not need to dwell on the differences, period. When I was younger, I loved to differentiate myself with the type of music that I listened to, the poetry that I would write, the books that I would read. And I remember even coloring my hair blue at one point. And I continued this differentiation by studying different theological books than my home church would prefer. And I think part of that is just part of kind of youth and part of wanting to be different. And what I find interesting is that, and what I also find beautiful, is that part of the journey is that we begin to look for more ways that unify us rather than ways that differentiate ourselves. And I've been thinking about, like, what are the things that, as we look on the political spectrum or on the religious spectrum, like, what are the things that can bring us all together? A shared desire for loving our world, a shared desire for peace, a shared desire to pursue justice. How do we all kind of rally around love? I think we would just have a much better world if we could all just focus on those places of unity and obviously focus and rally around love. Like, we all need to do a lot more of that. Rohr goes on and says, quote, "I'm not preoccupied with collecting more goods and services. Quite simply, my desire and effort every day is to pay back and to give back to the world a bit of what I have received. Period." We're saying here that giving back and helping others is a signal of movement into the second half of life. I think as we move away from our ego-driving, selfish ambitions and a need to consume things for ourselves, that our mindset changes to thinking about ways to give back to others. You see, if love is our focus, our question that we ask ourselves is, how do we love others? How can we give more to others? I mean, those are the key questions that we start to ask ourselves. And hopefully we start to ask those questions earlier in life, right? When we're younger, we have more energy, more time, more means to do so. So the sooner we can get to this place of wanting to give back, wanting to love our communities more, like, the sooner we move there, like, the more we can actually do. And Rohr is saying, like, at a very simple level, that our love for others and our world should be increasing more and more and more as we move further and further down the journey. That should be for all of us. Oh, and I love this line by Rohr. He says, quote, "Their God is no longer small, punitive, or tribal. They once worshipped their raft. Now they love the shore where it has taken them." Period. Once we arrive in this place of deep love and empathy, and the ability to see God's love all around us for all of creation, we realize how our path or vehicle to arrive at this awakening was never the point. Unfortunately, the path might have slowed us down because we focus on how our path was better than others. Rohr goes on and says, quote, "We no longer needed to change or adjust other people to be happy ourselves. Ironically, we are more than ever before in a position to change people, but we do not need to. And that makes all the difference. We do what we are called to do and then try to let go of the consequences. Period." And this is another beautiful movement when we begin to realize that we'll never be able to change other people. We accept them for who they are, and we learn to love them as they are, and not needing them to be something that they're not in order for us to be happy. It's that movement towards acceptance. And it's not that our viewpoints don't matter anymore. It's just that we don't feel a need to try to change other people's viewpoints. And that rarely happens anyway. It's also interesting that Rohr talks about focusing on our calling, our deeper sense of what we ought to be doing, which I'm sure is based on some way to love, to give back, to empower and care for others. I mean, that's the mission that Christ gives us, right? To love our neighbor as ourselves. I mean, that's the mission. That's the calling. Now, how we work that out in our own lives, how we're going to give back, how we're going to empower, how do we care for others, like how we individually do that, that'll be different for all of us. But the core mission, the core calling to love others, like that becomes the path. The sooner we can jump on that path, the better off we're going to be. Rohr goes on and says, quote, "The second half of life is a certain kind of weight to carry, but no other weight of being makes sense or gives you the deep satisfaction your soul now demands and even enjoys. This new and deeper passion is what people mean when they say, 'I must do this particular thing or my life will not make sense.' Your life and your occupation seem like two different things. Your concern is not so much to what you love anymore, but to love what you have right now. Period." That last line is one that sticks out to me. The journey in the second half of life provides us a deeper calling. I think this calling can come in earlier stages too, but certainly in the later stages, we see our calling more clearly. Like, how do we love others? How do we give more to others? How do we love those who are being oppressed? How do we help those who have been marginalized? How can we get involved in social justice issues? How can we donate to certain causes that will help our hurting communities? How do we love the unloved, the disinherited, the hurt, the broken? How do we do more loving? I mean, those are all questions that we need to sit with. And how do we love those that God has given to us as family members and those that are around us on a day-to-day basis? Our colleagues, our coworkers, our friends. Like, how do we love them more? Rohr goes on and says, quote, "The rules are all different now, and we often see it in older folks' freedom to give things away. Hoarding, possessing, collecting, and impressing others with their things, their house, or their travels are less and less interest to them. Inner brightness, still holding on life's sadness and joy, is its own reward, its own satisfaction, and their best and truest gift to the world. Period." Rohr is saying that our journey into the second half of life should lead us to less attachments, less collecting, and instead more giving. Our desires to please and consume things for ourselves should shift to desire to please, serve, and give to others. Our attitude of a bright sadness helps us to see and feel the pain in this world and those who are suffering. And that bright sadness should somehow make us desire to help those who are suffering through the giving of our time, our talents, or other ways that we can show love. And how can we make life a little better, a little easier to those who are suffering around us? This is going to require us to improve our awareness of what's happening. It's going to require us to be more sensitive to those who are hurting. And this means like getting educated on social justice issues. It's going to require spending time in building relationships and seeking out ways to help and love others that are around us. You know, this whole book, especially the first half of this book, has been about how life is hard and filled with suffering. And what is our response to that? How do we mirror Christ to love and help our hurting world? Like, how do we do that? And also, remember that Jesus said, to love our neighbor as ourself, which means that Christ is saying that you first need to be loving yourself. Because if you're not loving yourself, if you're not taking care of yourself, you can't have the emotional and physical energy to love others. And if we want to make the most impact, you want to love others more, you want to give more, Like, that means you need to take care of yourself more. You need to love yourself more. So don't forget that part of the journey into the second half of life, that aside from having the desire to love others, you need to be taking care and loving yourself first. Okay, now we're going to move into the last section of this chapter, where Rohr talks about how our calling includes falling into the good again and again. Rohr says, quote, "Strangely, all of life's problems, dilemmas, and difficulties are now resolved not by negativity, attack, criticism, force, or logical resolution, but always by falling into a larger brightness. This is the falling upward that we've been waiting for. Period." I think this is the first time Rohr uses the term falling upward. I can't remember. But this is the first time I think where he actually gives like a definition to it. And my sense here is that falling upward is a process of recognizing our own failings, our blind spots, our weaknesses, and being able to use this weakness, this brokenness, our failings, to empower and have empathy for others, to be able to love others more. And by the way, the awareness of the brokenness around us should constantly expand. Like, the more awareness we have to the pain around us, and also our own failures and our own blind spots, like the more awareness we have of it, the more we can grow in empathy and grow in love for others. And this awareness isn't just from focusing on the brokenness in us or those in our communities, but also looking outside our own communities and staying educated on the issues and challenges faced by those outside of our own group. For me, this means taking time to stay educated on the problems faced by our Black, Brown, and Asian communities. It also means being updated on the challenges faced by our LGBTQ communities and all those who have been oppressed and re-victimized again and again. It really means staying awake to the issues by constantly being a student and constantly staying educated and learning about what is happening to our communities and how can we be involved in the healing. This education never ends. There isn't some sort of like final degree when our schooling is done. Like, we're always going to be students. And part of our love for others means that we begin to love the education because it's helping us to discern and helping us to realize ways that we can help. I think it's the awareness that helps to lead us to understand our calling on how to help those around us. If we're not aware of the issues, if we're not aware of how different communities are hurting, how can we even begin to know how to love them? Like, it starts with the education. Like, that's the very first step. And that it's not like an education where you just read a book and now you're educated. Like, this is an education that takes time because issues are happening and things are changing and life is evolving. Like, our education is never going to stop. And for those that want to love others and want to care for others, like, we should be excited to continue to be educating ourselves. And especially getting educated on those communities and those groups that we're not part of. And how we do this is going to be different for each of us. We all have different backgrounds. We've all had different experiences. We've all had our own unique traumas and personal failures. And these experiences, our own unique backgrounds, our own failures, can provide fuel, if we allow it, to help others that suffer. That said, this will require each of us to love ourselves, be able to forgive ourselves, and that can take some time. Henry Nouwen has a book called Wounded Healer. And in many ways, that is what we need to become. We need to become healers to those that are around us. And that doesn't mean that we've completely healed ourselves. We're still in many ways broken and wounded. We have our own pain and trauma. And we will continue to struggle with that pain from our past. And I think this is part of that bright sadness that Rohr is talking about, where we're living in this place of pain and suffering. We see it all around us in our world. And we have our own pain and suffering that we've gone through in our life and maybe currently going through. And then be able to use that to love and care for others, to make someone's life a little bit better. It can kind of bring us to this place of bright sadness, where we're at once happy and finding joy in helping others, at the same time having a sense of sadness for the trauma and pain that they have gone through and for what we have gone through. It's this paradox, this sober happiness, this bright sadness that Rohr is saying that we are going to move into in a stage that we should all be at some point. And hopefully we get there sooner than later, because the sooner we get there, the more help, the more love we can give. Rohr says, quote, "The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. I learned this from my father, St. Francis, who did not concentrate on attacking evil or others, but just spent his life falling and falling many times into the good, the true, and the beautiful. It was the only way he knew how to fall into God." Period. Rohr reminds us again that actions speak louder than words. Modeling what love looks like is the best way for us to counter those seeking to hurt others. This means standing up with the communities that are hurting and finding ways to support them. I also love that Rohr points out that St. Francis spent his life falling many times into the good. It's like this constant process of seeing our own failings, our own sins, again and again. Like each time we're selfish, each time we're greedy, like whatever it is like that we struggle with. And instead of feeling defeated and useless and wanting to give up on ourselves or others, that we use it as a fuel to get back up, recharged to love again. The hardest part is getting back up, but that's really our mandate, to keep getting back up, to keep looking forward. Our trouble is we want to look back. We like to focus in on our failures and use it as an excuse to stay defeated, to stay down. And sometimes by looking at our failures, like initially it was a good thing to like look back, like, why did I fail? What did I do to mess up? And initially it could be a good task to like dwell on it and think about it, because identifying the reasons why we failed, we can learn from them. The trouble is sometimes we don't ever want to move out of that place of looking back. We want to just dwell and sometimes use that as an excuse not to get up. Well, I'm just going to fail again, so what's the point? Part of growth is getting back up, knowing full well, I'm going to fail again. Like part of life is just a series of failures, a series of sufferings. But growth happens each time we get back up. We need to stop focusing on our failures. We need to stop thinking that we're not cut out for something. We're not worthy to do something. You know, it's much easier to stay wounded. It's actually much easier to stay defeated, to stay down. It's not easy to get back up, to go back to your task, to go back to your mission, to go back to your calling, knowing full well that we're going to fall again. Like it's just a matter of time before we disappoint ourselves or disappoint someone else. Like it's going to happen. And Rohr is saying, like, how do we keep this attitude of falling again and again into the good, like St. Francis? It means recognizing that we're going to keep falling. We're going to keep failing. And self-love means that we recognize our own limitations, our own failures. And the key is getting back up and trying again and try to do better. And when we fail again, we get back up, we try again. Because if we are willing and loving to forgive others for their failures, and if we're compassionate to others when they make mistakes, and we all should be, like, part of loving others means that we continually forgive others and have compassion on others, right? And if we are compassionate towards others, if we're loving towards others, that means loving ourselves, having compassion for ourselves, and just getting back up. I think we forget that all the great leaders and spiritual guides had their own personal failings that they dealt with. Some of them we know about, some we don't. But the key is they kept going. And so should we. I mean, you just read some of the stories in the Old Testament about Moses and David, and you could read about their failings, right? These are supposed to be mighty men of God, right? These are people who failed constantly. And they were leaders. And guess what? They had to keep going. They had to keep getting back up. There are a ton more themes in this chapter, but those are the ones that really stood out to me. So, I'm not sure where you're at right now. If you're feeling defeated, heartbroken, feeling like it's not even worth getting back up to try again. If you're in that stage, just know it's time to get back up. And know also that you will fail again, and you're going to learn, and you're going to get back up. And part of growth and part of learning and growing in empathy means that we're going to constantly do some good things, we're going to fail, then try again. And I don't know if that makes you happy, but I think the trouble is sometimes we dwell on our failures way too long. We don't get back up, or we just feel like not worthy to even get back on our task because we messed up. And the message here from Rohr is that falling upward is the key. Like, we're going to continue to fall, but let that falling lead us into greater empathy and greater love and greater learning each and every time. So as a quick reminder, some of the themes that stood out to me in this chapter is that a bright sadness is this ability to accept the joy and suffering in life. We also talked about how the second half of life is looking for unity rather than those things that divide us. And that our second half journey leads us to focus on our calling. And our calling here includes falling into the good again and again and never giving up, but always getting back up and finding ways to love others and recognizing that we are wounded healers, that part of our role is to heal and love others while still knowing that we're wounded ourselves. Okay, so in the next episode, we're going to discuss chapter 11, which is called The Shadowlands, which is a chapter about identifying and removing our shadow self or our false self. These are the masks that we have used to identify ourselves with. And I found that chapter to be super, super helpful. And as a teaser, I want to read to you this line. Rohr says, "Your shadow is what you refuse to see about yourself and what you do not want others to see. The the more you have cultivated and protected a chosen persona, the more shadow work you will need to do. Period. Okay, so that's just a teaser for the next chapter, and I'm looking forward to discussing those ideas with you in the next episode. Take care.